I'm Charlie Melcher, founder of the Future of Storytelling. Thanks for joining me today for a very special episode of the FoST podcast. At FoST, we have the pleasure of working with artists and storytellers across all forms of media, but photography is one that is particularly near and dear to my heart. I began studying photography as an art form as an undergraduate at Yale in the mid-1980s. At the time, there was no venue for students to publish their work on campus, so I decided to start a photography magazine. Black and White, the Yale Undergraduate Photography Review, was my first publishing endeavor. Engaging in the creative act of editing, designing, and printing that magazine, and participating in the community that coalesced around it, made me realize what I truly wanted to do with my life. To use my head, hands, and heart to make meaningful and beautiful things, and to bring a community together around a shared passion and purpose. Through photography, I found my calling. It was during those formative years that I first met today's guest, Stephen Shore, who became a lifelong friend and mentor. Stephen has been lauded as one of the most important photographers of our time, known for his deceptively beautiful color images, his thoughtful writing about the medium, his devotion to pedagogy, and his determination to never stop finding new visual problems to solve. He was the first living photographer to have a solo exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and he's had 2 solo shows at MoMA, the first in 1972 and the second in 2017, as well as numerous other exhibitions at museums and galleries. He's been awarded a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, an American Academy in Rome Fellowship, the Royal Photographic Society Honorary Fellowship, and a Culture Award from the German Society of Photography. He's published more than 25 books, including one of my favorite books of all time, the seminal Uncommon Places. And he's been the director of the photography program at Bard since 1982. Stephen is someone who has dedicated his life to the art of photography, the pursuit of understanding how the medium works, what sets it apart, and what questions it's uniquely positioned to answer. Given our shared passion for the medium, I'm truly looking forward to talking with him about his life, his craft, and the second edition of his book, Modern Instances, which comes out this month. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Stephen Shore. Stephen, it's such a pleasure and an honor to have you on the Future of Storytelling podcast. Welcome.
Thanks, Charlie. I'm looking forward to it.
So there's this old adage that a picture is worth 1,000 words.
Yes.
I wonder, do you think that a photograph tells a story?
I don't think a photograph tells a story. I think there are some photographs that imply a narrative, that look like a film still, and imply a narrative the way a film still might imply a narrative. But actually tell a story? No. And not even a sequence of pictures does it very well. I mean, it can do it in a rudimentary way, but it's not really telling a very complex story. Compare it to what a film can do. You know, there's an Amazon ad on television right now, and it's a young couple, and they have a fight. And he goes off, and to console himself, he buys some fitness equipment on Amazon, and she buys a dress. And then they go out, and she goes out to a party, but then they both come home, and in their separate apartments, they both watch romantic movies on Amazon Prime. And then he goes to her door, and they get together. It takes 30 seconds. And it's much more complex a story than a Life magazine picture story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there's something that film does that's more complete or more powerful storytelling.
Yeah. It's narrative because it flows in time, because a novel does, because theater does. It can do things that a single photograph can't do, but this isn't a flaw of photography. It's one of its prime features, is that the image is decontextualized. It is taken out of the flow of time. It's taken out of the continuity of space. A photographer who understands how the world that we see and experience is translated into a photograph gets to use the medium to do what it does.
I've just recently completed reading and really enjoyed your book, Modern Instances. One of the topics that I found so interesting was the discussion of the act of making a frame, that decision that a photographer makes of sort of where to draw the edges and what to leave out. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, it's, in a way, the first decision a photographer makes. The frame has many functions in a photograph. The simplest one is what you described, drawing a line between what's in and what's out. But it's not as simple as that, because unless you're working in a studio with a white paper background, it's always cutting things off. The edges are never clean. And because of that, there's always the question of how much do you show on the edge of something being cut off? How does the edge create structure in the picture? As a line is near the edge, there's a little vibration between that line and the edge. Step back a foot and it changes. Move a foot closer and it may disappear. And so it is the beginning of defining what the content of the picture is, and it's the beginning of defining what the structure of the picture is.
In your opinion, there is a dialogue or there isn't a dialogue that you're intentionally having between your making of the image and the viewer's reading of the image?
When I'm in the midst of photographing, I'm not thinking about that. I'm just totally immersed in the process.
There was an interesting section in the book about structure versus composition and what photography does versus, say, painting.
It had always struck me when people talk about a composition of the picture. I know what they mean, but the word never sat right. The word compose comes from a Latin root, componere, which means to put together. The word synthesis comes from a Greek root, synthethenai, which also means to put together. Composition is describing a synthetic process. For example, a painting. You start with a blank canvas, and every mark you make on the canvas adds complexity to it. That's a synthetic process. A photographer does almost the opposite. They start with the whole world, and every decision they make brings order to it, starting with where the frame goes. And in this way, photography isn't synthetic, it's analytic. If I look at words describing analytic processes, I think of things like solution. Solving a picture seems more a description of what it feels like doing it than composing one.
Yeah, you use this phrase, a photographer doesn't put together an image, a photographer selects an image.
Yes. After a photographer has had a good bit of experience with the medium, seeing the world, taking a picture, seeing the result over and over again in different situations, there is a sense that their state of mind can be impressed upon the picture. Their sense of space, the clarity with which they're seeing, all of the subtleties of their state of mind, the subtleties of their perception guide the decisions they make, exactly where to stand, at what angle to the light as it reflects off things, exactly where the frame goes, that these decisions become finally guided by the state of mind of the photographer.
You introduce a concept which I hadn't been familiar with, which you referred to as objective correlative.
This is a phrase used by T.S. Eliot in an essay he wrote about Hamlet. And I don't have it in front of me. I do have it. I can find it.
I actually have it here too.
You want to just read it? This is
Sure.
what T.S. Eliot wrote.
The only way of expressing emotion in the form of art is by finding an objective correlative. In other words, a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events, which shall be the formal of that particular emotion, such that when the external facts, which must terminate in sensory experience, are given, the emotion is immediately evoked.
Yes. I was interested in it because 100 years ago, Alfred Stieglitz did a series of pictures of clouds that he called equivalents. He photographed clouds because he wanted to remove the photograph from the subjective reaction to content. You photograph a car and people have reactions to cars in a different way than they may have to clouds. He wrote that he wanted the pictures to be more like music. And in trying to describe this to students, other words don't exactly touch it. It's sort of like a metaphor, but it's not a metaphor. It's sort of like a symbol, but it's not a symbol. And the closest thing that I've come to a description of it is the objective correlative, that it does something to you by experiencing it.
And that's what you feel is happening successfully in a photograph when somebody has an emotional response to it.
Yes, and it's not just emotional. It could be, although Eliot was talking about emotional response, I think it goes beyond that, a larger psychological response. The only time I had the opportunity of hearing Walker Evans speak, and let me add that no one had a greater influence on my photography than Walker Evans, whose work I first encountered when I was given a book of his for my 10th birthday. I only heard him speak once, and it was in 1971 at the time of his large retrospective at MoMA. And the central point of his talk was to talk about his work as transcendent documents, which I was not expecting to hear. And what he was talking about was his photographs in a way as equivalents. And one way that I found of perhaps better elucidating how the connection between, or the difference between Stieglitz's idea of equivalent being associated with music, a more abstract medium, and the Walker Evans, is that a lot of music has words. And those words aren't abstract. Those words have real life associations. And yet it still can have the emotional and psychological resonance of music. And I think that's what Walker Evans was getting at. And that's what I think a lot of the best photographers can do, that they're looking out at the world and being sensitive to internal states at the same time.
I never knew that you had received a book of Walker Evans photographs when you were 10 years old. First of all, that's not a normal gift for a 10-year-old. And perhaps that helps to explain why you became so precocious as a photographer. I mean, your young career was more than most people could dream to accomplish in their entire lives. Tell us a little bit about your early life as a photographer, let's say for the time you spent at Warhol's factory and then up to your one-man show at the Met.
So I started very young, and I feel very fortunate that there have been a number of people who influenced my life through gifts or other associations that completely changed the course of my life. And it begins with an uncle of mine, my mother's brother, who, knowing that I had an interest in chemistry when I was 5, for my 6th birthday, gave me a Kodak darkroom set. Now, let me add that I'm on Instagram, and I post fairly regularly. And last month I posted, or actually it was in July, I posted a series of pictures that I had made exactly 50 years before. My birthday is October 8th. On October 8th, I'm going to post a picture that I printed as a result of this gift 70 years before. So I wasn't taking pictures, I was using my family's brownie Hawkeye negatives and printing them. And I did this for a couple of years before I started taking pictures. And then the summer that I was 8, I got a manual 35 millimeter rangefinder camera. And the rest is history. But also, it's like, I feel like in a certain way I was destined to do it. When I was 14, I approached Edward Steichen to show him my work. Now,
of course you did.
a pushy young New Yorker, knowing little sense of restraint. So for whatever reason, he was very gracious, bought 3 of my prints. In my junior and senior year in high school, I became interested in film and started going to film screenings almost every day. I don't even know how I pulled this off. I really had stopped going to school. Typically seeing 2 movies a day. There were great theaters in New York then. The Bleecker Street Cinema had mostly European or South American, Asian films. About the same time, Jonas Mekas opened the Filmmakers Cinematheque, which had what might be, I guess, called avant-garde films. And I made an 8 millimeter film that was shown there the same night that Warhol premiered The Life of Juanita Castro, and I was introduced to him. And the factory was famous at the time in New York circles, and asked if I could come and photograph. And he said yes, and I spent 3 years there. At that point, I realized I couldn't maintain the pretense of being a student, and told the school and my parents that I was dropping out.
And this was high school you dropped out of?
Yeah, this is my senior year in high school.
And you didn't go on to college, right?
No, but my college was on East 47th Street between 2nd and 3rd Avenues.
Yeah.
The other thing I got from him is, people think if I do interviews about that period, people want to hear about the parties and the drugs. Andy worked every day, and he had a work table, like a 4x8 plywood work table, and he'd come in the early afternoon, and he had projects every day. And some people like to create in solitude. He didn't. He drew energy from people around him. And this is why the factory existed. He wanted people around him, and he would involve them in what he was doing. And so let's say he's working on the cow wallpaper and trying different color combinations. And he'd say, "Oh, Stephen, which color do you like?" And having other people around focusing on what he's doing, and he was getting energy from that. But what I got from it was I saw how an artist makes decisions. I got to see in a day-by-day way an artist who worked every day make aesthetic decisions and play with things. Try something. This didn't work. Try something else. And to see this over a 3-year period, I came away with an understanding of aesthetic intentionality and a creative process.
Incredible experience. And then after working there and working on films with him and photographing, how did you then end up eventually getting a one-man show at the Met?
Well, I was an ambitious young man, and my ambition went beyond being an acolyte of Warhol's. I saw people for whom this was their life. Like this was their claim to identity, was to be a follower, to be hanging out at the factory, to be in the group that he took to parties every night. And I just had more personal ambition than that. And so at some point I realized I have to leave. This is not my golden age. I'm only 19 by the time I left, 18. Through my association with him, became very interested in serial imagery and also became interested in a lot of conceptual art and began doing conceptually based sequences. So I brought them to the Met, to John McKendry, it was then the Department of Prints and Photographs. And he said, come back in a week, and I did, and he had one of them framed, which I wasn't expecting because the Met didn't show living artists. It was their policy. And what I didn't know was this was 1970, the 100th anniversary of the founding, and the trustees decided to change their policy and begin to show living artists. And the first show was sculpture by Jules Zalitsky. The second show was collages by Joseph Cornell, and I was the third show.
And you were how old then?
23, I guess. And it was a shock. I mean, it's like, on one hand, your dreams come true, and then it's like, then what do you do? And I was really, I think, emotionally unprepared for that experience.
I mean, it must have been a little bit like an athlete winning the Olympics at 23 and then retiring or wondering what am I going to do now that I've got a gold medal.
Or maybe it's related to the Sports Illustrated curse that, when your picture's on the cover of Sports Illustrated, then you flop after that. And so it forced me to go into a new direction. I saw this as work in progress, and the progress stopped. It really was a shock.
So you and I met, first of all, when I was a student at Yale, and that was a really informative period in my life because I was very actively studying photography as a form of storytelling. So even though we've started this conversation with you saying you don't think photos are stories or even sequences of photos, I remember at that point sitting down in the Art and Architecture Library and taking out Lee Friedlander's Factory Valleys. Beautifully printed book, beautiful collection of photos, and studying that page by page, image by image, thinking through why this sequence of photographs appeared in this way. What were the decisions? What were the sort of story that was being told by Lee Friedlander? And then I actually wrote my senior thesis on Robert Frank's The Americans. And I was trying to bring a kind of critical practice to a sequence of pictures, to a collection in a very seminal photography book. And I wonder about, several questions here, but one, you mentioned the Walker Evans book that you received at 10. Were there other books of photographs that were major influences for you?
So in the late 60s, I was sequencing my work for a catalog, a Swedish catalog of Warhol's first big European retrospective. And the editor of the catalog, when we finished sequencing my pictures, said, I have something to show you. And we're at a loft in Soho with a big open space. And he laid out Ed Ruscha's book, Every Building on Sunset Strip, which is accordion shape. And it's Every Building on Sunset Strip, as the title implies. And I saw how the kind of conceptual frameworks I was thinking about at the time and bookmaking and aesthetic intention all came together, and went to the best contemporary art bookstore in the city, which was Wittenborn and Company on Madison Avenue between 78th and 79th, and went there and got all of the Ruscha books at the time. But this happened later, and this was the beginning of the post-Warhol phase of my work.
It's amazing to me how the book as a art form itself, the photo book, has become so popular and so revered. When I started my career, first job out of college at Aperture, creating photo books, I would have never guessed that 25 years later it would still be thriving. I would have thought it would be out of business as a field. And to the contrary, there are dozens of photo book publishers around the world making a living and turning out beautiful work. And I wonder if you have thoughts as to why this has thrived and been accepted.
I think a few years ago, some photo book publishers experimented with digital books, and no one wanted them. People like the physical object of a photo book. I would assume art books too, but photography books, the surface of a photograph is very similar. It's a kind of nondescript surface, and it's the same kind of surface as a reproduction in a book, as opposed to, say, Anselm Kiefer painting, where there's no way to reproduce the experience of a Kiefer painting, forgetting scale. And there could be scale issues in photography books too, but just the physical experience of a Kiefer, where he is attended to every square inch of the surface, and the surface is dense and three-dimensional, it can't be reproduced. A photography book can. Also, photographers are prolific. How many